Flexibility as an issue has been sort of rising into business consciousness for the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And a lot of research has been conducted around the topic. A lot of papers have been written about it. And it's starting to be talked about in company corridors as well. For many business leaders and for many people in organizations at all the different levels, the topic of flexibility is still heavily associated with women and for caring responsibilities. So when we do sort of raise the subject of flexibility, the immediate connection is with that sort of gender bias. And with the legislation that's just recently been passed, we really wanted to examine whether that trend is still very strong or whether things are changing around that. And is it becoming a more gender neutral topic? With the introduction of the Amendment Act on the 6th of March this year, obviously every employee at every stage of the employment life cycle for any reason is now eligible to a process, to an application process around flexible work. So organizations still obviously have their businesses to run, and there's a number of criteria that need to be met in order for flexibility to be granted. But in some ways, it appears that the legislation in New Zealand is a little ahead of practice, which is a little unusual really, because in most countries, in most other areas, you'd find that the legislation lags behind business practice and really sort of comes in to support that practice. So we have a lovely research report that we encourage you to take a copy of when you leave. And what I'd like to do now is just talk you through some of the really highlights of the research, and also to kick off with have a look at some of the mega trends that we believe are starting to impact the need to look at this topic more closely. So I'd like to keep it interactive. So if you have any questions or comments, please, it's an informal setting, so please feel free to raise your hand and we can talk that through. And we'll kick off. So one of the key drivers for flexibility in the workplace is the unprecedented level of ethnic diversity that we have in the workplace and in our communities today. We have one of the highest rates of immigration per capita in the OECD, and our workforce is set to grow until about 2020 when it starts to level off, but the biggest contributor to workforce growth is actually immigration. So it really gives you an idea of what the future workforce, what the current workforce looks like, in fact. The Department of Labour predicts that between 2006 and 2026, those are the stats for ethnic growth. So you can see that the European segment is only going to grow by about 5%, and in contrast to that, the Asian segment by 145%. So it's a rapidly changing face. And when you think about the issue of flexible work for migrants, I'm a migrant myself, I totally understand this. You come into a new country, you have to be economically active. You don't have a support network, you don't have peer groups. So, from a flexibility point of view, you really will gravitate towards those roles which allow you to be economically active and have a better work-life balance. So it's a real issue for people coming into the country. We all know about the aging workforce, and statistically we're doing quite well in New Zealand because we have one of the highest rates of employment for older people in the OECD. By 2050, 1 in 4 New Zealanders will be over the age of 65. So if you think about that in terms of flexibility, these are people who are looking after grandchildren, have sort of, worked very hard their whole careers, and while they're still wanting to be in the workforce, they're wanting to have some flexibility around how that work is designed. So gone are the days where you retired at the age of 60 and fell off a cliff. Many people, for financial reasons and just for personal reasons, are wanting to stay connected to the workforce and wanting to stay in the workforce for a lot longer. But the way they work is, lends itself to the flexible work practices. They're looking to design work in such a way that they can have it all. And economically, we need to be able to accommodate this workforce because, we have a real shortage of talent, and that's not going to get any better, any easier. Currently, we have about 46% of women with primary caring responsibilities and 36% of men. So really, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone in your workforce who doesn't have caring responsibilities, whether it's for children or whether it's for elderly parents or whether it's for loved ones or people who are ill and that sort of thing. Flexibility is the #1 issue around this, and we'll see from the research that it's still the #1 reason people request flexibility. However, the notion of women being carers and men being workers, of course, is starting to be neutralized, and especially since the GFC, there's been an emergence of the female breadwinner, and Sydney University has been starting to do some research on this as well because it's becoming such a dominant topic. So there are very many men in the workforce who have primary responsibility for caring for children or elderly parents, and we really need to think of it as a gender-neutral issue. Female workforce participation is one of the things that's really been driving this topic around flexibility. And since 1986, the participation by women has grown by 50% in New Zealand. So it's a pretty stark statistic. There are also a number of older women who are transitioning back to the workforce, so driven by economic necessity. Once again, many of these women have worked in their earlier lives, then left the work environment to raise a family and have come back into the work environment maybe at the age of 55 or thereabouts, and they don't necessarily have the skill set either. So these are women that sort of are falling into that older category. They may have caring responsibilities for their family members, but they also may want to pursue some other interests in their lives as well. So for this group of people, flexibility is equally important. By 2025, 3 times as many women as men will have graduated from New Zealand institutions. So once again, with the predominant caring responsibility, this really creates the necessity to look at work design. And it really is a little bit of a myth that millennials and Gen Y don't want flexibility. These are people who really want to be in the workforce, but they want work designed in a way that suits their personality and their interests. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So millennials are starting to make a real impact on the workforce. This is our emerging workforce, and for many people, it's really the interest of the work that they're after. They want to work in such a way that they can blend their private lives and work lives, and for them it's all about outputs. It's not about time spent or presenteeism. They don't want to climb the corporate ladder. They don't even recognize the corporate ladder, and they certainly don't want the top job. Okay, contrary to popular belief. We speak to many organizations and senior managers in organizations who believe that, these guys are wanting to get to their job in about half the time that they got there. And in reality, research doesn't bear that out. Research says these guys want to be economically active, but have work designed in a way that is enjoyable and sustainable for them. Many of these millennials are also looking for opportunities where they can have a part-time role, but also perhaps pursue a business interest on the side and pursue sporting activities and that sort of thing. So we'll see what the research says about that group of people. So those are the things that are really, I guess, mega trends that are setting the seed for flexible work. And we'll hear a little bit later from Kevin about the global position with regards to all of this. But these are issues that are not going to go away, and they're just going to become more pronounced as we move into the new century. So really, it's a topic that we have to think about for the long term. So with the introduction of this new legislation, we really wanted to understand what the impact would be on the workforce, and also what some of the key barriers are against applying for flexible work for employees. So we set out to survey the market. We joined hands with OCG, and we got Colmar Brunton to do the research for us. We had a really good response rate right across the different industry sectors. So we've broken the data down to reflect some of the industries that you'll be in. And the gender balance for responses was also what we expected. We expected that it is a topic that is sometimes more important to women, and so we did get a higher percentage of female respondents. The majority of respondents were in the 31 to 45 year age group, And that's not surprising to us either, because from that perspective, these are people who probably have children they're caring for, or older people, and are starting to sort of pursue other interests as well. So let me just qualify how we defined flexible work when we went out to market. So many organizations have variation in hours within the 40-hour week, okay? And so when you canvass the market on flexible research, if you don't qualify what you mean by formal flexibility, you'll find that most organizations say they have 90% flexibility. So this is a reality, but this is really just a variation in the 40-hour week. And you'd be hard-pressed to find an organization that didn't allow someone to go off for a doctor's appointment early and then come in earlier the next day, or make the time up. If you had that sort of practice, you probably wouldn't have any staff, because they would leave and go somewhere else. So what we mean by formal flexible work is flexible work that is documented in your organization, and probably an arrangement for more than 6 months or more, and one which is kind of like a regular pattern of work that you have, whether it's the time you spend, or whether it's location you work at, or the way your work is designed. So this is what we mean by formal flexibility. And so you can see that only 28% of the workforce that we canvassed has formal flexibility, which is very, very low, considering that the legislation allows for 100% of the workforce to apply for flexibility. The vast majority are still women, 69%, and the main reason is still 42% is for caring responsibilities. So that we kind of anticipated, and we understood. 46% of workers are in this age group, and I guess the interesting thing about this age group is that they're probably the leadership bench for tomorrow. They're probably the guys who are going to move into your executive team at some point, the women and men. So very, very interesting. When you look at sort of executive level roles, there's very little flexibility. So there's almost a breakdown between the group that are the leaders of tomorrow and the way they work, and the way the current executive level are working. And that really has some implications for who's going to put their hand up to move into an executive role if they have to forfeit their flexibility. Interesting question to ponder. In terms of the industry breakdown, financial services is really at the top of the list with regards to formal flexibility. It's still very low, but the banks particularly are really leading in the space, and many of the banks are now putting out overt statements in their recruitment advertising to say, we not only allow for flexibility, but we encourage flexibility. So when you apply for this role, come and talk to us about your particular needs. So that's a fundamental shift from what we've seen in the past. Most flexibility that we currently have has been as a result of someone working in the organization for a period of time, developing sort of a relationship of trust with their manager, and then having a special circumstance and taking that to the manager, and the manager grants them flexible work. But what we're starting to see is roles at the entry level into organizations being advertised flexibly, and organizations just saying, look, we subscribe to this practice, so we're not going to tell you how you should work, you just come and tell us how you would like to work, and we'll see if it can work. So the financial services sector are really moving in this space, and it's putting a little bit of pressure on some smaller finance organizations as well, because you're competing for the same staff. And so it's really a matter of organizations in this industry making sure that they remain competitive in this area. Government and public sector is also doing quite well in this area, and I think that the perception has always been that in the government and public sector you may earn less, but certainly you have more reasonable hours anyway. So they're really starting to adopt the formal flexibility. And then interestingly, IT and telecom is relatively high compared to other industries. So you'll see in the report that for the rest of the industry sectors, the formal flexibility is around 1 or 2 or 3%, so much, much lower. And it's an anomaly that we've sort of been discussing, because I guess what's interesting about that is that currently in New Zealand, about 80% of IT workers are male. So they've got a high level of male workers, and a relatively high level of flexibility. So we don't know why that is, but research tells us that in the sector, it's much easier to manage work remotely. So there is the element of the IT to support that, but also it is much easier to to monitor someone who's writing code, for example. Either they're writing code or they're not, and whether they're sitting on the beach writing code or whether they're sitting in an office writing code doesn't really matter. So the way, I guess, the services that are provided in the sector and the technologies to support flexible work means that they have a fairly high take-up of flexible work.